I have thought and thought about tonight, and something been pulling me one way or the other. One was about the railroads of Washington County, and the other, the families and the community that was involved in doing this. Now, normally when we're here on a Boones Creek historical moment, we're talking about very specific things that applied to Boones Creek that deals with the railroad. Most notably, you would probably come through the Boones Creek Road, you see the big trestle out there. If you take the bountiful book that we have, on the inside cover, we have a picture of that. Or you can look at the train station, the Boones station, and the store, which is on page 11 and 12, and he'll give a little bit of a history. But I want each of you to understand that the railroads in Washington County did not just benefit Boones Creek. It was a major economic force for the development of all of Upper East Tennessee and even Southwest Virginia. Specifically, it was in Johnson City and Kingsport. And what I want to do is give you a little bit of history as to how we got here, and maybe give you some examples of my personal relationship with the railroad. One, the railroad began in the 1830s, interest, but it was 1846 before there was any movement. And by the time of the Civil War, they had a railroad that came through this area. The railroad came through, and it was one of the main lines that went from down in the southern part of the state up through Richmond. Now, after the Civil War, there was a lot of ravage on the roads, the railroads itself and the ties, and they became run down. So they started developing other roads. There's three major railroads that have come to Washington County. One of them started out as the East Tennessee, Virginia, and one was the East Tennessee, Georgia, which united and what ultimately became a 3CC, it's 3Cs railroad. It was a ambitious project that was to go from Cincinnati and Chicago all the way down to the East Coast. It was to come through here, and as it was coming through here, it came through Washington County, came through Johnson City. And by the time it came through Johnson City, things were beginning to really grow. And then we got a second railroad came through town. It was the ETW&C. A lot of these have to do with the economic boom. And by the 1890s, Johnson City was considered a boom town because it had two railroads. And it was such a boom town growing that the President of the United States came here on a train in 1891 in April, President Benjamin Harris. It was a big to-do to have a president come because it was such an economic boost in this area. The only problem is, 2 years later, there was a big depression in our country. The railroads suffered greatly, including this area, and the railroads that came through suffered, and they ended up selling off part of the railroads that came through. And as they were selling them off, I'm skipping a little bit because I only have so much time, but when they started selling off some of these railroads, there was a guy called George L. Carter. Some of you may or may not have heard him, but he's one of the biggest names in East Tennessee and Southwest Virginia. He owned one time almost 300,000 acres of coal mines up in Virginia. He owned big part of South Johnson City. He donated 120 acres to build East Tennessee State University. But one of the biggest projects he had was he took part of the railroad that came through Johnson City that was being sold off, and he decided he was going to build it to supply all that coal he had to come through Johnson City in Washington County and take it over to North Carolina. So he first built his railroads that came through this area. And of course, coming through this area, he envisioned Kingsport to be an industrialized town. He bought 8,000 acres in Kingsport, and he was probably the father of Kingsport. His brother-in-law, J. Fred Johnson, you might have heard the stadium over there, that was his brother-in-law. Well, he built this, and they used some really interesting engineering techniques. When they took the old railroad bed that came through from Bristol to Johnson City, and they said, that's not suitable. That road went from St. Paul, Virginia, all the way to Irwin. But it had too much grades, too steep to have these coal mines. So what did he do? He decided what affected Boones Creek more than anything, he decided just to abandon that railroad bed that was already existing and build another one from Irwin, Johnson City, all the way back up to St. Paul on a new location. And guess where he came through? He came through Boones Creek. When he came through Boones Creek, he had to build, they tried to keep the grade no more than 1.5% because of they had such heavy loads on it. They didn't want steep curves. So there were times that they had to go through mountains or hills. At the time, the old railroad only had one tunnel in the whole system. Carter, before he finished up, had 50 tunnels. He had 15 in Tennessee. 2 of the tunnels in Tennessee is in Washington County, Boones Creek area. The Indian Ridge Tunnel is 472 feet long. It's 1,072 yards, and the one in Gray is 472 feet. A lot of you probably don't know they had 2 big train tunnels here right in Boones Creek area. But they came through this area, and then they had the trestle, which was it was 800 feet long and 80 feet high, which was a marvelous thing during that period of time. And they had to have a grade of over 400,000 cubic tons of rock to fill this grade for the Indian Ridge. So all of this really promoted Boones Creek. I think it's going to have to be another night when I give in specific examples, but what I want you each to understand is history is not just talking about facts. History is talking about how it relates to you. And how the railroad relates to you, if you each look at your families, you'll probably find in your family certain things that would stand out that relate you to it. Just for instance, 2 of the main families in Boones Creek, the Keeblers, which sold the property to the Kefauffers, and the Crouches, John and Julia got married and had a daughter, Catherine, who married a Lucas in Johnson City, who was my great uncle. And interesting, his middle name is Keebler. And he turned out to work in Johnson City for George Carter in 1908 when he started building and designing this through Boones Creek. And so your family, you can dig into it and you can see. I'm probably going to go a little more in depth to the railroad at a later date, but I would suggest that if any of you have an interest in the railroads, contact me because I have a lot of information about the railroads that led to the development and the impact it had on Boones Creek. That's a history moment for tonight. Thank you.